Good evening. This is Forum Daily for Tuesday, May 20th. I'm Julie Stoutland, filling in for Teresa Skubik. Canada, the United Kingdom, and France have issued a forceful condemnation of Israel's expansion of military operations and other actions in Gaza and the West Bank. A joint statement warned of taking concrete actions, including sanctions if Israel doesn't cease a renewed military offensive and lift restrictions on humanitarian aid. The countries added that they support Israel's right to defend itself against terrorism, but insist that only allowing a basic quantity of food into Gaza is wholly inadequate for the current level of human suffering in the region. The interim president of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs believes that the statement from the three countries undermines a statement Prime Minister Mark Carney made to Israel's president in Rome over the weekend.
Prime Minister Carney and President Herzog of Israel had a positive meeting over the weekend in which the two agreed that Hamas must lay down its weapons and have no future role in the governance of Gaza as a fundamental principle. And the statement that was issued the following day by Canada, the UK, and France placed the onus principally on the Israelis to cease their military operation. And fundamentally, it's important to understand why this war is taking place at all. And it's taking place because on October 7th, 2023, Hamas conducted a vicious and brutal attack, an invasion of Israeli territory, during which it murdered thousands and abducted hundreds of hostages, some of whom still remain in Hamas captivity today. And fundamentally, for this war to come to an end, it's an absolute necessity that Hamas is no longer in a position to repeat another October 7th type massacre, as it is explicitly vowed to continue to do. And the hostages have to be released. That's where the onus needs to be, because absent that, there's no pathway to ending the conflict that has had such a horrific impact on innocent Israelis and Palestinians alike. Well, I think it's telling that it was no less than Hamas, the listed terrorist entity here in Canada, that came out to applaud this statement, and that should give everybody pause about what this statement means and who it's supporting.
And we were joined by Asher Westrop Evans, journalist and Israeli citizen spokesperson, for a reaction from Israel.
Look, I mean, there has been distinct anger and frustration at this, and I think this isn't just in relation to this particular letter and this particular comment coming from the UK, France, and Canada. Israel has for a long time been incredibly frustrated with the fact that so many in the international leadership and in the international community still don't seem to understand the need to keep the pressure on Hamas. That when you make statements like this that undermine Israel's goals to get the hostages back in order to remove Hamas from power, to disarm the extremists and de-radicalize those radicalized people inside Gaza, when you put the pressure back onto Israel and remove it from those other parties, you undermine the entire war effort here and the whole goal of Israel, which is to remove Hamas from power, not just for Israel and Israel's future, and not just to return the hostages, but also for the people of Gaza who have been under the yoke of Hamas now since Israel's departure back in 2005, effectively 2007, once they were formally installed in power. I mean, this status quo needs to be changed, and there's only one way to do it, and that's removing Hamas. And statements like this simply suggest that Hamas may in fact be rewarded for their actions on October 7th by getting to stay in power and getting to retain power in the Strip. Yeah, well, there's a few realities we need to understand here when it comes to conversations around aid into Gaza. The first and foremost being that when aid enters Gaza, it is summarily, and people have been using the term hijacked by Hamas. It's not hijacked by Hamas. It's given directly to Hamas as the de facto government there in Gaza. And they then utilize that to sell this aid that was given for free to them by the United Nations, by international organizations, paid for by the taxpayers of France, the UK, Canada and other countries around the world, they take this aid and they resell it on their own markets back to their own people for a profit, sometimes a significant profit, while ensuring that their coffers are filled first and foremost, that their fighters are supplied, and then they use the money that they receive from that in order to continue to pay their fighters and continue to rebuild the infrastructure wherever possible that they can, for their immense military infrastructure, the 400 or so miles of tunnels that have been discovered under Gaza. That all came from the sale of these sort of goods to the people of Gaza. So that's the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand is that back when the ceasefire was in place, back when the phase 1 operations were going on and we were seeing hostages being released, there was approximately 25,200 trucks that entered Gaza during that period. We're talking around 400,000 tons of aid entered the Gaza Strip, and that's more than 1/3 of all the aid that entered Gaza throughout the entirety of this now 19-month-long war. They were supplied and stocked, the people of Gaza, with enough calories and enough supplies of food to last them anywhere between 6 to 8 months, depending on estimates. Now, about 11 weeks later, we're being told that people are literally starving to death. Now, it doesn't take advanced mathematics for anyone to understand if that much food went in and now people are, if they are indeed genuinely suffering and starving, which is a horrible situation, then somebody must be hoarding food. And it doesn't take a genius or a leap of logic to suggest that that would be Hamas or other militant factions inside Gaza who are controlling and hoarding food to keep the supply tight and keep their own people suffering.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has acknowledged that his decision to resume aid to Gaza came from pressure from allies. In a video statement posted to social media, Mr. Netanyahu said Israel's allies had voiced concern about images of hunger and warned, quote, with that, we will not be able to support you. Mr. Netanyahu said that the food aid to be let in would be minimal, without specifying precisely when it would resume. Israel said it would resume aid deliveries into the war-battered territory after a complete halt on imports since early March. Prime Minister Mark Carney said Sunday the Liberal government will present a federal budget in the fall, allowing time for clarity on some key economic and fiscal issues to emerge. Speaking to reporters Sunday in Rome, Mr. Carney defended his government's decision not to deliver a budget this spring, saying there is little value in rushing the process.
There'll be a budget in the fall. In the short term, it's a very short parliamentary session that is coming up. The speech from the throne is on the 27th, as people know. The House is due to rise under the House's rules by the 20th of June, so it's really 3 weeks. We have some very clear priorities, which, as you know, from following those who followed the campaign, those who followed my remarks, those who followed my opening press conference, would include the federal government taking all the steps it can to help create one Canadian economy out of 13, in addition, initiatives such as the middle class tax cut. But there will be a budget in the fall. This is, in fact, based on my economic experience. There is not much value in my judgment, and it's considered judgment, and it's judgment based on experience, that there is not much value in trying to rush through a budget in a very narrow window, 3 weeks, with a new cabinet, effectively a new finance minister, just reappointed, but a new finance minister, rush that through, for example, in advance of the NATO summit, which happens after Parliament rises. So the NATO summit, 23rd, 24th, that is going to be a very important event for the security of Canada, but also it will have fiscal implication. It will have budgetary implications for Canada. That's one example. To have a budget before we substantially advance further our discussions with the Americans with respect to our economic partnership, to have greater clarity around that. I'm not saying we'll have perfect clarity, but to have greater clarity around that. Again, that's another factor. A third factor, one of the things that we emphasized and are working on from the start of this new mandate is improving the efficiency of government spending, looking where we can reduce costs at all possible, and improving the productivity of the public sector. We are launching that those set of initiatives, having greater visibility on that as we prepare a budget. All of those three factors, so defense spending, the economic outlook, including the tariff relationship with the United States and the efficiency, all of those coming together, we will have a much more comprehensive, effective, ambitious prudent budget in the fall. You do these things right.
A spokesperson for the federal finance minister says a summit this week in Alberta will be an opportunity for countries to work together despite tensions around U.S. tariffs. Francois-Philippe Champagne and Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem will lead the meetings with top finance officials from the G7 nations tomorrow and Thursday. The global economy, the war in Ukraine, and artificial intelligence are some of the key topics on the agenda. The meeting is a precursor to next month's G7 Leaders Summit in Canada. All right, stay tuned. Coming up, Mark Carney wraps up his visit to Rome and his meeting with Vladimir Zelensky. And the EU issues fresh sanctions against Russia. Stay with us. Prime Minister Mark Carney has wrapped up his visit to Rome and Vatican City, where he attended Pope Leo's inaugural Mass and also held various meetings with his counterparts and delegations from around the world. While overseas, Mr. Carney met with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky and reaffirmed Canada's steadfast and unwavering support for Ukraine.
The Canadian people stand in steadfast and unwavering support of your leadership, of the people of Ukraine. We admire what you're doing. We admire your commitment to peace, as you've demonstrated again this week. And we underscore that there can be no peace without the full support and participation of Ukraine, and that you have our absolute.
Ukraine's president thanked Mr. Carney and all Canadians for their support of Ukraine in response to Russia's invasion and pressed the need for more sanctions against Russia.
As you 100% rightly said about Canadian people unwavering support from the very beginning of this war. We're thankful to your people, and of course I want to share with you some brief about our peace talks in Turkey.
Yes.
I think that it's important. It's important when two sides want to finish the war, and we really waited for Putin, and he didn't come. We think that he's afraid of bilateral, just direct talks. But anyway, I think that the decision of exchanging of prisoners, war prisoners, is very important. 1,000 people, it's a lot. And I hope we will get this result. And of course, we have to make pressure, more pressure on Russia, on Putin, to really to make peace as quick as possible. And of course, unconditional ceasefire is very, very important. That's why we need to pressure on him, more pressure, more sanctions. We are thankful to your packages of sanctions and the European leaders, and of course, the United States of America. And I want to discuss it, and your presidency in G7.
Yes.
All these things are very, very important. So happy to see you.
Very good.
The first meeting.
Yes. Thank you. Very good. So we have, as you heard from the President, many important issues to discuss, very fluid situation. And one last point, I very much look forward to welcoming the President to Canada in less than a month for the G7 summit.
This weekend's trip marks Mr. Carney's first overseas visit since his win in last month's federal election. U.S. President Donald Trump says Russia and Ukraine are set to negotiate a ceasefire immediately. No time frame was given for any discussions following the president's separate phone calls with the leaders of both countries.
Well, I want to thank everybody. We just spent 2.5 hours talking to Vladimir Putin, and I think some progress has been made. It's a terrible situation going on over there. 5,000 young people every single week are being killed. So hopefully we did something. We also spoke to the heads of most of the European nations, and we're trying to get that whole thing wrapped up. What a shame that it ever started in the first place. So.
In Mr. Trump's 2-hour call with the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin said Russia and Ukraine would need to find compromises to suit all parties. Russian and Ukrainian delegations did meet this past weekend in Turkey for the first time since 2022, bringing a limited exchange of prisoners but no pause in the fighting. Our correspondent Adam Zivo has more from the Ukraine.
So let's talk about the context of how this announcement actually occurred. Earlier this month, on May 9th, Russia celebrated its annual Victory Day parade. Putin unilaterally announced a 3-day ceasefire coinciding with his festivities. In response, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky proposed a 30-day unconditional ceasefire, which Russia then rejected. The day after Victory Day, a consortium of European leaders representing the coalition of the willing, so that would be the leaders of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Poland, came to Kyiv, and after having a conversation with Volodymyr Zelensky, they jointly announced a demand that Russia accept a unilateral 30-day ceasefire, which was supposed to begin on the 12th of May, on a Monday. Obviously, these demands were not in Russia's interest because Russia has insisted for several years that any ceasefire should come only after peace negotiations are concluded and should not be set as a precondition for any talks. And it is widely assumed that this is because Russia wants to press its military advantages to the greatest extent possible to extract further concessions from Kyiv. In response, Putin simply ignored the ceasefire and counter-proposed immediate peace negotiations within Istanbul. The coalition of the willing didn't seem that interested in accepting or even entertaining these peace talks because Russia has made no indication that it's willing to make reasonable demands. Putin has continued to insist that any peace deal tackle the root causes of the war between Kyiv and Moscow, which is code for the establishment of a Moscow-friendly puppet regime in Kyiv. Additionally, Putin has insisted that any peace deal require Ukraine to withdraw its troops from the 4 oblasts that Russia is currently partially occupying. So effectively, Russia is asking Ukraine to cede more territory as a precondition for peace. Trump characteristically upended things. He announced on Truth Social that he wanted peace negotiations to begin right away, and consequently, the coalition of the willing toned down its rhetoric concerning the imposition of harsh sanctions. The deadline for the 30-day ceasefire passed. Russia continued to bomb Ukraine, and it faced no sanctions as a result of Trump's intervention. The Istanbul talks collapsed predictably right away. They lasted for only 2 hours. The two parties were able to agree to a limited prisoner exchange, but everything fell apart after the Russians insisted that Ukraine cede these 4 oblasts that I mentioned earlier. The collapse of the Istanbul talks could have been a victory for Ukraine, as it would have allowed Ukraine's allies to say quite clearly that Putin is not interested in serious peace talks, therefore we need to impose sanctions. But Trump interceded once again and claimed on social media that Putin hadn't attended the talks simply because Trump wasn't there. In doing so, he gave Putin an excuse for his absence. In the days following the collapse of the Istanbul talks, Trump said that he was going to have a phone call with both parties, and that's exactly what he did. And after Trump had these 2 phone calls, he announced that both parties, both Ukraine and Russia, had agreed to immediately begin peace negotiations. Now, one thing you'll notice here, though, is that there is no requirement of any ceasefire between the 2 parties. So Trump had essentially pressured Ukraine into accepting Russia's preferred position, which is to negotiate while military hostilities are still ongoing and while Russia can still chip away at Ukrainian territory. Additionally, Trump positioned Russia as a potential economic ally and emphasized how much money could be made through trading with Moscow. The White House said that if Russia doesn't engage in good faith in these upcoming negotiations, then that could lead to further sanctions. But it's hard to take that seriously when Russia has quite obviously not acted in good faith up until this point, and that hasn't resulted in any consequences at all. In a better universe with a better, more reliable, more principled U.S. president, we would already have European sanctions constricting the global trade of Russian oil. But unfortunately, Trump seems committed to giving Putin more and more and more chances to delay. Now, if there is any bright side to this, it's that Pope Leo XIV has volunteered to have the Vatican act as a mediator between the 2 parties. What this means is that Ukraine may be engaging in negotiations on friendly territory, given that Pope Leo has spoken out against Russian imperialism and has taken a quite pro-Ukrainian stance in comparison to his predecessor. So perhaps if these negotiations happen in this venue that might benefit Ukraine, it's unlikely that it will produce a real peace deal, but who knows, it might create some great photo ops or symbolic victories for the Ukrainian side. Not that that's sufficient, but it's better than nothing. So that's my take on things. I don't think that these negotiations are going to go anywhere. I think that this is Putin yet again playing Trump for the naive fool that he is. And I think that this is just another obstacle that Ukraine will have to overcome in its defense of its own sovereignty.
Saturday's accident that saw a Mexican Navy sailing ship on a global goodwill tour strike the Brooklyn Bridge in New York City remains under investigation.
Imagine you rent the boat for the night and then it collapses the second it takes off the dock.
The crash snapped at the ship's 3 masts, killing 2 crew members and injuring 19 others, including some left dangling from harnesses high in the air. Senate Minority Leader and New York Democrat Chuck Schumer says any investigation should look into whether the Trump administration's federal hiring freeze affected the U.S. Coast Guard's staffing levels and accident response. Coming up after the break, inflation in Canada dropped sharply in April to 1.7%. And we're joined by economist Dr. Moshe Lander to unpack the latest figures. And we'll be speaking to Brian Passafume about a recent car collision that killed 3 and injured 3 others. Stay tuned. Canada's annual inflation rate was 1.7% in April, down from 2.3% in March. StatsCan says that the end of the consumer carbon price drove inflation down sharply. It contributed to gas prices falling 18.1% year over year. But that relief didn't extend to grocery stores, with prices there rising faster than the overall consumer price index for the 3rd straight month. Fresh vegetables, beef, and coffee and tea were some of the items costing Canadians more on an annual basis. Dr. Moshe Lander joined us for his reaction to the latest inflation figures.
So the Bank of Canada has a bunch of measures of inflation they look at. The CPI is the headline one that we often see in the press. And so when that number is falling, then it's probably due exclusively to the withdrawal of the carbon tax. And so if you look at natural gas prices and gasoline prices, they were down substantially. The Bank of Canada does look at other measures, though, and one of them is called core inflation. So it strips out food and energy prices, which are really volatile. If you take a look at that measure, inflation was actually up compared to March. And so it also includes the food part, which is rising faster than inflation. So even that suggests that there is underlying pressure beyond just food and falling energy prices that should have the Bank of Canada at least raising an eyebrow. Nothing that they necessarily need to raise interest rates quickly about, but just something that they need to monitor. In terms of food pricing, remember that when we report inflation, whether it's core inflation or just regular inflation or any of the other measures, it's an average. And so within any average, there are going to be some things that are above and some things that are below. And so if food is above the average, that in itself is not worrying. Something has to be above average. And what inflation is trying to capture is what the typical consumer is buying. So there are going to be things that the typical consumer buys that are above average. But it's more than that. It's a weighted average. So even if you say, yeah, but food's a huge part of the story, well, then food is given an outsized weight within the calculation. So I think that that's not anything necessarily to hit the panic button over, but it is the type of thing that consumers see maybe more regularly, certainly than their rent. They go shopping more regularly, and maybe than some of the other smaller items, which accumulated as a bunch of small weights are flat or falling, but they maybe don't see it as much, right? So it's kind of like small events with dramatic outcomes tend to capture the imagination more than regular events with non-dramatic outcomes. Beyond that, I don't think that there's anything necessarily here that people have to worry about. We're still under tariff threats, and we really haven't seen the major impact that everybody was worried about at the beginning, and that's probably a positive sign to me.
Canada's unemployment rate ticked up to 6.9% in April, Statistics said on Friday, matching the highest rate seen in 8 years outside of the pandemic. The economy added a very slight 7,400 jobs during the month. Most of the increase was due to temporary workers hired in the public sector to work on the federal election. There were also job gains in finance, insurance, real estate, rental, and leasing. Without the bump from federal election hiring, the economy would have lost more than 30,000 jobs in April. Jennifer Neville Lake made a post of grief and solidarity following a fatal collision that ripped a family apart. Ms. Neville Lake's children and father were killed in a crash in 2015 when a drunk driver crashed into their vehicle. Her post comes after a 19-year-old man was driving allegedly intoxicated early Sunday morning and smashed into a minivan, killing 3 of its occupants and injuring 3 others. The 3 people that died were children aged 6, 13, and 15, while 2 adults and another 10-year-old child are in hospital. The Toronto Sun's Brian Passafume has more.
Yeah, so the crash happened over the weekend. It was just after 12:30 in the morning on Saturday. So what happened was the suspect, the accused, was driving his minivan from the eastbound off ramp on Highway 401 on the Run Forth in Etobicoke, which anybody who's driven on the 401, it's a pretty busy intersection at the best of times, and even 12:30 at night it can still be. It's a pretty treacherous stretch of road. So what police say is that the car was traveling high rate of speed, lost control, and struck a black Chrysler minivan that had 6 people in it. 3 of those, 2 of the people were declared dead at the scene. The 15-year-old and 13-year-old. There was a 6-year-old girl was transported to hospital, and she was pronounced dead later in hospital. The children's mother, a man described as an acquaintance of the family, and another 10-year-old kid, but they're still recovering in hospital. Did take someone into custody at the scene. 19-year-old Ethan LaHoulier of Georgetown was arrested. He was given at least a dozen charges, everything from dangerous driving, impaired driving, dangerous driving causing death. He appeared in court on Sunday, but as it stands right now, there's no more details on exactly where the case or the investigation's going, and we won't know those details till it goes to court. But honestly, right now, like these sorts of collisions, they're horribly tragic, but they're pretty cut and dry when it comes to determining sort of the mechanism behind the crash. I mean, they have the suspect in custody, they have the scene well contained right there. So really, all right now is just a matter of just gathering evidence for it.
And in response to the tragedy, a GoFundMe campaign has been launched to raise money for the family.
Yeah, a family friend launched it over the weekend. They initially set a $25,000 goal, and I'm just looking at it right now as of when we're talking. $127,000 has been raised so far. So it really seems that people's generosity and hearts have really gone towards this family. With several donations of over $1,000 by some people. The family's been identified as the Lavinia family. Don't know exactly their story, their background, or anything like that, but they're described as a core to the community. And yeah, the money is promising to go directly into the family's bank account. And yeah, it seems that Torontonians and people across Ontario and across Canada, their hearts have been out to this family, and they're really trying to help them, bury their children and get on with their life with this horrible tragedy. Unfortunately, these sorts of things, they don't go away right away. You've got the trial, which unfortunately re-victimizes people, and it just sort of brings back these horrible memories. But really, it's the money, and more importantly, the generosity that the Torontonians and Ontarians and even Canadians have expressed toward this family. They do make a big difference in the healing process.
The Nova Scotia government will begin covering the cost of the shingles vaccine as of May 28th for residents aged 65 and older. Premier Tim Houston says that residents can start booking appointments today for the shots, fulfilling a promise he made leading up to his November 26th re-election.
Today is another step along the way, and today we're here to talk about the shingles vaccine, free shingles vaccine for Nova Scotians over the age of 65. This is something we talked about on the campaign, and if you know somebody who's had shingles or suffered from shingles, it's pretty debilitating. It could be a really nasty condition for sure, and there's a vaccine, but the vaccine is often just out of reach financially for too many people, and I think that the statistics are that one in three Canadians will suffer from shingles, and we can do better than that. So we want to make sure that this vaccine is in reach. So today we're announcing that appointments are open starting today for Nova Scotians over the age of 65 to get that shingles vaccine. The vaccines themselves will start on the 28th of May. So it's imminent. I'm proud of that. It's a significant investment from the province. We estimate in the first year the cost would be around $26 million. But this is an investment in healthcare. It's an investment in Nova Scotians. We really want to make sure that we remove the barriers to maintain opportunities for people to be vaccinated and to be healthy and thriving. So I'm excited about this. This is good news. It's good news for everyone. So if you're over 65, get your appointment starting today and get your vaccine starting on the 28th. But happy to be able to make that announcement for Nova Scotians today. And thanks for joining us here. It's an important day.
The health department says that the cost of 2 doses of vaccine is about $400. The premier was also asked if the coverage will extend to booster shots as well.
Does the funding cover the subsequent booster, or is funding just for each?
No, so the 26 million, that's the one this year for the initial one, but we're going to make sure that people are fully vaccinated with all the shots that they need.
But I guess what I want to make sure I understand is the booster also free, or would people have to pay for the booster?
My understanding is that everything people would need. So maybe Dr. Strang. I'm gonna go to my phone a friend here.
Yeah, no. That's part of the budgeting. We know that people need 2 doses, 2 to 6 months first dose, then 2 to 6 months later a second dose, and that part of the budgeting. So yes, both doses are covered. If you haven't been vaccinated, it's not over 65 and above, then you can start getting, and both doses are free.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. Canada Post says it's received strike notices from the union representing some 55,000 postal workers, and operations are poised to shut down by Friday. The union informed management that employees plan to hit the picket line starting Friday morning at midnight. Canada Post says the disruption would deepen the company's already grave financial situation, and both sides should focus on hammering out a deal. A work stoppage would affect millions of residents and businesses who typically receive over 2 billion letters and 300 million parcels a year via the service. Our news director has more on the potential strike action.
Yeah, so Canadians may be looking at another strike with Canada Post. You have to remember that it wasn't that long ago, over Christmas, the Christmas season, where Canada Post was on strike. And so we could be veering very closely to a similar situation. The workers' union could be striking as early as Friday morning if a deal is not reached. And the carrier has said that what Canadians should be expecting essentially is either a national labor disruption or rotating strike activity. And so for a national disruption, that will mean that parcels and mail won't be delivered during that time period, and new items will not be accepted either. Now, during a rotating strike, that is a little different. Canada Post would continue delivering in unaffected areas while limiting services in others. And so the impact there will really vary depending on where the rotations happen. Now, the union for the workers has essentially issued this strike warning because they are worried that Canada Post may unilaterally change the working conditions and suspend employee benefits once the current agreement expires. Now, they have said that there is still time to return to the bargaining table,
and that they do remain committed to negotiating a new collective agreement. So there is still some interest to get a deal done, but it is important to remember that last week contract negotiations were paused, largely because they were failing to make progress on some of the key issues, one of those being weekend delivery options. And so it's really unclear what's going to happen next. The deadline is now ticking for both parties to get back to the table and try and hammer out a deal. What we do know is that the impact on small businesses could be significant. The Canadian Federation for Independent Businesses has said that the impact on small businesses could be upwards of $1 billion in lost revenue. You also have to factor in that would be happening in the context of this looming trade war with the United States, potentially the impact of tariffs. It would also obviously impact Canadians in terms of how they receive mail, bills, etc. And so the prospect of a strike here is coming at a really difficult time for small businesses, given the trade war. It could also seriously upend how Canadians receive the things that they usually receive in the mail, whether that be letters from other people, but more importantly, how bills are communicated to Canadians. Now, what we may see here, depending on if a strike happens and how long it happens, is some pressure on Ottawa to change the rules on who can deliver mail, specifically letters, because Canada Post has an effective monopoly on the delivery of letters. That isn't something that is on the table as of yet, but it's something we're going to keep an eye on, because if the strike does go on and does go on for quite a while, there is going to be pressure to continue to have mail delivered. So we will see what happens in the lead up to that deadline on Friday morning.
Joe Biden's office says that the former U.S. president has been diagnosed with prostate cancer. The finding came after the 82-year-old reported urinary symptoms, which led doctors to discover a nodule on his prostate. Mr. Biden was diagnosed with prostate cancer on Friday, with the cancer cells having spread to the bone. While aboard Air Force One, Vice President J.D. Vance spoke to reporters about the former president's diagnosis, saying, quote, "We really do need to be honest about whether the former president was capable of doing the job."
We wish the best for the former president's health. And, it sounds pretty serious, but hopefully he makes the right recovery. Like I will say, whether the right time to have this conversation is now or at some point in the future, we really do need to be honest about whether the former president was capable of doing the job. And that's no, that you can separate the desire for him to have the right health outcome with the recognition that whether it was doctors or whether there were staffers around the former president, I don't think he was able to do a good job for the American people. And that's not politics. That's not because I disagreed with him on policy. That's because I don't think that he was in good enough health. In some ways, I blame him less than I blame the people around him. And why didn't the American people have a better sense of his health picture? Why didn't the American people have more accurate information about what he was actually dealing with? This is serious stuff. And this is the guy who carries around the nuclear football for the world's largest nuclear arsenal. This is not child's play, and we can pray for good health, but also recognize that if you're not in good enough health to do the job, you shouldn't be doing the job. Okay.
Mr. Biden's office said that this represents a more aggressive form of the disease, but the cancer appears to be hormone sensitive, which allows for effective management. Andrew Donaldson from OrdinaryTimes.com has more on the diagnosis.
The diagnosis itself is very serious when you have a man of advanced age and you have a cancer that has spread to the bone. That is very bad news. And Joe Biden, the man, whatever you think of anything else, is a horrible diagnosis for him and his family. And our thoughts and prayers are with him. Now, the timeline of Joe Biden, the former president, is what made this story so explosive all throughout his presidency and up into the debate that ended his political career for all practical purposes. And he lost the election, where he had that disastrous cognitive episode on national TV during the debate over his fitness as president, has just boiled over all of this. Now, the whispers were before that because he was the oldest president at the time we had ever had, and there was all kinds of things, including now something that will be endlessly picked apart. He had a misspeak at the time. That's what it was called when he actually said, "I have cancer," and said, no, he just misspoke. He had one of his Biden moments. All the little things of that over the last few years are now going to be called into question. Now, we don't have access to his actual medical records, but a lot of people have very fair and very skeptical questions over the health of this president in the last year or so of his presidency. Going back to Watergate, and what our national media covering the presidency has always seen as their lodestar is the national media brought down Richard Nixon. What did they know and when did they know it? And that's what they were going to play ball all over this story, except we know for a fact they didn't. Now, you have things like the Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson book out here saying, well, the media was lied to, but Jake Tapper was a moderator on one of those debates. The idea that the entire media, especially the media that is friendly to President Joe Biden at the time, didn't know about this or didn't have some kind of inkling that things were not going well, kind of strains credulity. And that's what's firing up this controversy so much is you have a very Trump-friendly media that is going to be all over this story. You have a media that now didn't do what did they know and when did they know it, because they are now a part of this story of how they covered the president. Underneath all this, you have a national populace that is looking at a midterm election and still rehashing the last one. And you have a Democratic Party who should be in a position to do well in those midterm elections, but is now saddled with, did you cover for Joe Biden, which is a story that should have been settled when the American people rendered their verdict of no, Joe Biden is not fit to be president in the election. This is a lot of cross streams that has a very human story that everybody can relate to underneath it. An elderly family member that has cancer, almost everybody's had one of those, but the politics of this story is going to keep it going for a very long time. We did not get clarity with this announcement. We got more questions, and we probably got a lot of answers we may never get, but the political cycle is going to go forward, and people are going to speculate, and it's Joe Biden and his team's own fault why that speculation is going to be so rampant.
Biotechnology company Regeneron Pharmaceuticals is buying 23andMe for $256 million, just 2 months after the genetic testing company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. In March, 23andMe said it was looking to sell, quote, substantially all of its assets through a court-approved reorganization plan. Regeneron said today that it will also comply with 23andMe's privacy policies and applicable law, process all customers' personal data in accordance with consents, and have security controls in place designed to protect such data. Netflix has thrown Sesame Street a safety net with a new streaming deal.
Whoa. Num, 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 num. Num, 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 num. Ah. Ooh.
Monday's deal offers the popular children's staple a broad reach while keeping it on its long-standing home with PBS. No specific premiere date was immediately announced. The change for the more than 50-year-old show comes after Warner Brothers Discovery decided last year not to renew its deal for new episodes on HBO. I'm Julie Stoutland, filling in for Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news today. Take care, Canada.